Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you joining us here today in today's Dev Talk, which is jointly organized and co-hosted by the OECD Development Center and on the other side of the Atlantic, the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. My name is Raga Árnadóttir, and I'm the director of the OECD Development Center. And I would like to start, of course, by wishing all of you a happy New Year. Today's talk is about climate and debt. I don't want to sound gloomy so early in the year, but the debt crisis that developing countries already faced in 2021 is looking more severe in 2022. Only this week, the IMF rang alarm bells about the impact of higher interest rate in advanced economies on the debt sustainability of developing economies at a time when the debt service suspension initiative has expired and the G20 common framework on debt treatments has been slow to gain traction. Meanwhile, we can be sure that the climate crisis will worsen in 2022, a scary prospect when one remembers everything that happened last year. For developing countries, climate change is already having a profound impact on lives and livelihoods, damaging infrastructure, and in some cases, jeopardizing their long-term viability. Financial constraints resulting from the impact of COVID-19 on public expenditure or public revenues, and debt service costs are preventing efforts to enhance resilience to climate shocks and leading to falls in key areas of public spending. In many cases, access to the level of resources the developing countries would need to invest in the green transition are only a distant dream, especially with advanced economies not yet meeting their climate finance commitments. Stark choices are emerging for many developing countries between their global and environmental commitments and the imperative of addressing urgent domestic concerns and avoiding a lost decade of development. But while the situation and the picture that I'm painting here looks bleak, this talk gives me hope. Today, we will hear how to address two of the foremost challenges facing developing countries by considering debt and climate together. In this way, we can tackle global debt while preserving or even increasing funding for initiatives that build resilience to climate change or indeed actively combat this existential threat. And I don't expect it to be easy. While it might be particularly important today, the idea of linking debt and environment is not new. In times gone by, it has not been implemented at sufficient scale to make a major difference on either front. There are also issues about how to quantify the impact of environmental policies, a topic that we addressed here in a Dev Talk in November about how to value natural capital. This year will provide a number of opportunities to get this idea moving, including the COP15 Biodiversity Conference and COP27 in Egypt. So we need to move fast. And again, this is why I'm particularly excited about today's panel. Our distinguished speakers bring to this topic not only unique insights and experiences, but also a broad range of perspectives. I would like to say in particular how honored we are to have two members of the Vulnerable 20, or the V20 group of Minister of Finance of the Climate Vulnerable Forum among our panelists here today. And without further ado, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our speakers and introduce them here to you. We have with us here today, first, Alagi Fadera, who is Director of National Development Planning at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs in the Gambia, which is a V20 member. We have Thierry Watrin, Green Economy and Climate Change Advisor for the Ministry of Economic Planning in Rwanda, also a V20 member and a member of the Development Center of the OECD, I might add. Jeroen Settelmeijer is our third panelist. He's the Deputy Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department at the IMF. We have Professor Uli Volz, founding director of the SOA Center for Sustainable Finance. And last but not least, we have Yolanda Fresnillo, policy and advocacy manager on debt justice at Eurodat. A warm welcome again to all of you, and many thanks indeed for joining us. Just for the practicalities, once I've asked 2 questions to our speakers, 2 rounds of questions, we will have a Q&A session where I welcome questions from the audience. If anyone in the audience would like to ask a question to any of the panelists, please add it to the chat box at any point, along with your name, and I will make sure that it will be posted in the Q&A session. And as I have been entrusted as the timekeeper, I just want to emphasize to our distinguished panelists to mind the time limits so as to allow for the Q&A session in the end. And one final note: this event is being live streamed on the Global Development Policy Center YouTube channel, and you can watch it all again afterwards if you missed anything, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording. But now, without further ado, to get us started, I would like to ask the first question to Uli. Could you please give us sort of the bird's eye view of the global debt situation and how it relates to climate change?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raga. It's really a great pleasure to join all of you for this really important discussion. So we clearly have a debt crisis looming in the global south, which is not only impeding governments' responses to the COVID crisis, which is far from over, but also undermining the ability of many governments to invest in climate resilience and sustainable development more broadly. So over the last 2 years, high public debt service and insufficient fiscal and monetary space has already constrained the crisis responses of most developing countries. The IMF has shown that the fiscal measures taken to limit the fallout from the pandemic were much smaller in low and middle income countries than in advanced countries. UNDP currently estimates that more than 70 low and middle income countries face debt vulnerabilities, and many of them are facing severe debt vulnerabilities. And as you mentioned in your introduction, the tightening of global financial conditions in response to the mounting inflationary pressures could severely aggravate debt sustainability problems. And indeed, we've already seen that many developing country central banks had to tighten monetary policy in order to stabilize inflation and exchange rates. And once the US tightening gets started in serious, this will make life much more difficult for many developing countries. And the problem is that in many low and middle income countries, external public debt service is already crushing and much greater than, for example, healthcare expenditure or education expenditure. And so despite all the rhetoric we're hearing about sustainable recoveries and building back better and all that, many developing country governments are really struggling to adequately support their people to cope with the current health and socioeconomic crisis. But then even worse, overstrained public finances are then also impeding much needed investment in development and climate resilience. And these developments are really urgent. Governments must climate-proof their economies and public finances because otherwise they are facing an ever-worsening spiral of climate vulnerability and unsustainable debt burdens. We've shown in a number of studies that actually have been also replicated and confirmed by IMF research, that climate vulnerability is driving up the cost of capital and worsening sovereign risk. And there is a real danger that vulnerable developing countries will enter a vicious circle where greater climate vulnerability raises the cost of capital and diminishes the fiscal space for investment in climate resilience, which is so important. And as financial markets increasingly also price climate risk, and global warming accelerates, the risk premium that countries have to pay now, which are already very high, often are likely to increase further. And the COVID crisis, or the effects of the COVID crisis on public finances, is really reinforcing this vicious circle. And in many countries, including many small island development states, but also beyond that, high public service is very much crowding out critical investment that is needed to climate-proof these economies and enable what should be a green, resilient, and equitable recovery. So, for example, if we look at debt service in Caribbean countries, which are, of course, among the most vulnerable with respect to climate change in the world, debt service absorbs often between 30 and 70% of government revenue, providing very little room for immediate crisis responses, but also very little room for investments in climate resilience. And the diverging macroeconomic developments that we are seeing now really puts a threat that many countries in the global south will, instead of having a decade of action to deliver the global goals, that they are facing a lost decade for development. And for the time being, the global community is really lacking an effective system to address debt distress. I mean, the G20, as you all know, took a number of steps, but as for example, also the IMF managing director highlighted, these haven't really been satisfactory so far. So we urgently need to develop solutions to this looming debt crisis, and we do this now. This is not a conversation we should be having for the next couple of years. We really need to be moving to developing solutions that will deliver real debt relief to a large number of countries, and not just a handful of low-income countries. So that's why it's so important to have this conversation on debt and climate, and also debt sustainability swaps. But as a last point, I'd like to highlight that conventional debt for climate or debt for sustainability swaps will not do. We need much more ambitious approaches to really tackle the debt crisis because the challenges are enormous. And we need to be very clear, if this debt crisis is not addressed, then we can completely forget about SDGs and climate action in large parts of the world. And the impacts would be really devastating. And I'm sorry if I'm not putting a more positive picture here now.
Thank you very much. No, it's true. The picture is not positive, and that's why the importance of what you said, that the solutions need to be discussed now, not in 2 years' time, is of great importance. If I might turn now to you, Jeroen, given the cost of inaction on climate change, given that they're totally catastrophic, to what extent should international efforts to address that distress also incorporate climate change and resilience? Over to you, Jeroen.
Thank you so much also for inviting me. And just to say from the outset, I agree with a lot of what Uli said. I agree that there are links between the debt and the climate crisis. And I would describe them as links that go in both directions, but whether they do go in both directions is really case dependent. So what Uli emphasized was the notion that the climate crisis generates a debt crisis through the potential costs of climate change on that country, and possibly through the feedback loops through debt costs, borrowing costs. And so I think that is a relevant channel, but it's a relevant channel for a relatively small group of countries at this point, right? So it's clearly relevant for the V20. I don't think it's relevant for most of the countries that are currently experiencing debt distress, right? For the most part, debt distress is unrelated to climate problems. But then, these countries have another problem which goes in the other direction, which is that because they are in debt distress, they have very little fiscal space, and that prevents them from undertaking the adaptation and mitigation investments that we all need. Right? So in that sense, there's a link, but it goes in the other direction. So, we basically at the IMF, we view these as two problems that are linked, but they are distinct. And we have to address them not just with one instrument, debt climate swaps, in some expanded version. Again, I agree with Uli that the current template has been unsatisfactory, but with many instruments. And so the way we would look at debt swaps is not debt climate swaps, is not so much as an instrument to address debt distress, but as an instrument, among others, to increase fiscal space for many reasons, but in particular to undertake climate investment. So it is one among several instruments for climate finance. Now, there is two important caveats, and where I do agree with Uli that they can be key to get at the underlying debt distress problem. One is the V20 type example, namely when debt distress is actually caused by lack of adaptation. In that case, would be rational from the perspective of a creditor to link debt relief to climate action, because unless you have this climate action, the debt problem will reoccur, right? So the debt problem is as sensitive, or perhaps more sensitive, to climate actions on the side of the debtor as it would be to macroeconomic adjustment or reform on the side of the debtor, which is usually what debt restructuring agreements emphasize. So that is an important class where I fully agree that linking debt relief to climate action is critical. And then there's a still, I think, pretty narrow class of restructurings involving the private sector, where the willingness of the creditor, even when the debt problem is not per se caused by climate change, the willingness of the creditor to actually give debt relief might be higher if it is conditional on climate action. So the nice example here very recently is Belize. Now that was more in the biodiversity area, but it also links climate. So I think those are the links where it really matters. Let me stop here. You're still muted.
I apologize. I muted myself, but thank you, Jeroen, for giving us this interesting viewpoint. And I would like to go to the Gambia now and hear from Alagi. Could I please ask you to briefly describe to us how you see it in the Gambia? How is that service holding back investment, development, and climate resilience in your country? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Raga. We're very pleased to be part of this webinar and this development talks from the Gambia. As you know, even before the pandemic, Gambia was in debt distress, then recovered a little, but we're still at high risk of debt distress. In terms of the pandemic, so far only about 10% of the population is vaccinated, which is very low. And if you look at the impact of the pandemic, it has had serious implications on livelihoods, economic growth, but importantly on fiscal space, as well as our investments in financial and human capital. In terms of how the debt service is holding back investments in development and climate resilience in the Gambia, even before the pandemic, we've been facing major liquidity pressures, especially before the change of government in 2016. So government's ability then to service external debt currently has been constrained by our export profile and domestic revenue. And if you look at the Gambia, tourism is a major contributor to the economy, especially in terms of a major foreign exchange earner. Some of our export products like peanuts have not been doing very well. So add the pandemic to all this, that means it has made the situation even worse. So the government is focused on making sure that the needs of the population are met during the pandemic. We've at least been able to provide some relief, food relief at the height of the pandemic, the fourth wave especially. But if anything, the pandemic has shown the vulnerabilities that exist. And this therefore underscores the need to focus great amounts of spending on health and infrastructure. In terms of the overall economic situation, the pandemic has really created a major challenge for us. And government tried to put some strategies in place for fiscal consolidation before the pandemic. But if anything, the pandemic has kind of eroded some of those efforts. Secondly, we've already formulated a debt management strategy for 2022 to 2026. So if we add the climate change issue to the whole picture, it even makes the choices that we have to make much more difficult. And this affects our ability to invest in the development of our people, but also to attract new investment in climate action in very meaningful ways. Because to a large extent, all this depends on our fiscal situation. We have to know that the Gambia is among the countries that has received debt service relief through the IMF's Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, as well as the debt service suspension initiatives. But we know this will only provide some kind of temporary relief. And if anything, we have to look at some robust and long-term measures that will help countries like the Gambia that are at very high risk of debt distress, as well as other V20 countries that are in similar vulnerable situation. As a government, we appreciate these efforts, and these initiatives have really helped to provide some room for government to focus on some urgent priorities, especially in terms of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, what we're saying is we're not yet out of the woods as far as the pandemic is concerned. And from the earlier interventions, you will see that the climate change picture is even becoming more bleak. And I think from COP26, our expectations, especially the B20 and some of the more poorer LDCs, we felt that we could have been very ambitious and the agreements could have been more robust. So given the prolonged nature of the pandemic and the need to invest in our communities and to build climate resilience and climate-proof infrastructure, we need instruments that will match those levels of ambition and help provide a lot of relief and fiscal space for us as LDCs in the V20 countries to be able to invest in our people and be able to address the climate vulnerabilities that already exist. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Alaki. And now I would like to give the floor to Thierry to explain to us how the climate vulnerable countries are responding to these twin crises or even triplet crisis if you have COVID, death, and climate. And Thierry, ahead of COP26, the V20 released a proposal for debt for climate swaps and climate prosperity. Could you please tell us briefly what the key aspects of that proposals were?
Yes, absolutely, Raga. Thank you for the question. So there are two questions. Maybe I will just start with a few introductions. so that people who listen understand who I am. So first of all, I am happy and honored to be joining today. I am working in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning of Rwanda, and I am part as well of the V20 representatives. Despite the unprecedented disruptions brought by the COVID-19, Rwanda has continuously moved toward a greener economy. Throughout the challenges of the pandemic, the financing the vaccination program was one of the biggest. In the whole world, there were 6.4 billion vaccines administered globally. Only 2.5% have been administered to Africa, sources World Bank. Whereas the continent is actually accounting for 17% of the world's population. So some people would just take the case of Rwanda and say, look, you have a vaccination rate of 42%. You're one of the few countries in Africa to have surpassed the 40% vaccination rate. This is true, and this is based on leadership, efficiency, and transparency. But that's a drop in the ocean. If you look at the Africa side and the Africa continent, we have to ensure not to look and not to see the wood for the trees. So those very low figures of worldwide vaccination, what do they say? They stress and they highlight the struggle to access financing and debt management. As part of the vulnerable 20, Rwanda, Gambia, who's here, and Alagi told it, 10% vaccination rate only. So those figures show that the struggle is real. And so the vulnerable 20 members, we work towards ensuring access to international finance based on the fact that not all of the countries have the fiscal space. And Yuli was talking about it. We don't have the fiscal space nor sufficient access to international investments to be able to fight COVID as hard as we could. That's why we want to emphasize inclusiveness when it comes to climate finance. Inclusivity is even more crucial given that vulnerable countries often experience debt distress. To talk about the climate actions, Rwanda and many other African countries have taken on their NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Our national ambition is to be as well a 38% reduction into GHG carbon emissions, GHG emissions. Just for that, just to meet our NDCs, the estimated investment is 11 billion USD, just to meet our national NDCs. So from that point of view, you understand the importance of the debt management and how big the numbers are. Now we need to focus on access to debt restructuring for V20, and we should think about debt relief. Alagi was talking about the debt relief they had, but we believe as well that other financial products can help the vulnerable 20 countries. For that, there is the climate swaps debt, which is an adequate solution to invest and to tackle at the same time the challenges surrounding climate change and the pandemic at the same time. Just to conclude with, debt restructuring is essential for countries fiscally constrained, but at the same time determined to strengthen their climate action plan with their NDCs. Most of them have done it and submitted it to the UN. The principle is quite simple, just redirecting the debt payments toward climate resilient projects. And this helps not only to protect existing investments, but it supports bolder green projects. This is where as well global coordination and multilateral agencies have a key role to play. I think there's OECD, the IMF is here as well, so I will let them share their views on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thierry. And finally, in this round, I'm very pleased to have Yolanda here with us to explain the role of the civil society in this situation. Yolanda, civil society actors have been particularly active in highlighting the interwoven impacts of the climate and debt crisis. Could you talk to us about some of the social impacts of indebtedness compounded by the climate impacts?
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation to take part in this, I think, important and key discussion, and particularly for the question, because, I mean, behind all this data and all these dynamics and financial dynamics, what we have is actually people suffering, people having to go through the pandemic, people having to look for jobs that they lost during the lockdown, and people suffering these costs of this vicious circle between debt and climate, as Uli mentioned. I will highlight two areas of concern. The first one is on unsustainable debts. Unsustainable debts, and I have to say that in many cases, these unsustainable debts, as Mr. Sedlmeyer said, are not explained in a full picture by the climate vulnerabilities, but these climate vulnerabilities increase accumulated unsustainable debts. So the V20, but also other countries have bigger debts because of bigger capital costs for climate vulnerable countries, because of having to borrow to invest in climate resilience. 2/3 of climate finance are in the form of loans, in many cases non-concessional terms, particularly for middle-income countries, having to borrow to recover from climate extreme events, because there doesn't exist any loss and damage financing mechanism. Well, these high and unsustainable debts are undermining today and in the past the capacity of governments not only to invest in climate action, as Olive also explained, but also to deliver on quality, accessible, and gender-responsive public services. As we know from previous experiences and from previous debt crises and from the analysis of present policy advised by the IFIs and mainstream economies, even when there can be social protection floors in place, fiscal consolidation, which is the main response to this debt crisis, has a direct impact on government investment in public services, in subsidies for the poorest, in public workers' wages, in investment on economic development or an economic recovery from this multidimensional crisis and from the pandemic. Already in 2019, we analyzed the data from the previous year, showing that as debt payments were increasing, already before the pandemic, education and health expenditure decreased in many developing countries. This is a real risk. This is a real risk today, and this is especially a real risk that can be worsened in the next few years. And this has a particular harmful effect on women's rights and on gender equality. For instance, as debt payments increase, governments tend to accept the recommendation of cutting food, agricultural, or energy subsidized, leading to food prices increases, which particularly affect women as food and home energy providers. This is worsened by the climate change impacts in agriculture. As public services are cut due to debt crisis, health centers, schools, and water provision facilities lack investment or even close, which affects particularly the caregivers, increasing the burden of unpaid care work on that most women provide. This is also worsened by the climate emergency, as climate extreme events might impact on these infrastructures, and that governments won't have the resources to reconstruct those public services. Furthermore, the need for increasing resources to repay this external debt often means a reinforcement of natural resource exploitation in the global south, as the governments in the global south have little options but to exploit even fossil fuels, which in too many occasions implying land grabbing and therefore less access to land for the poor, and particularly, again, women and indigenous communities. On the other hand, we have the impacts of climate change. Countries with high debt are less prepared to react to climate extreme events or onset events, leaving the population less protected. And this is particularly worrying in the absence of what the civil society have been calling for instance, an automatic debt repayment standstill mechanism on the wake of a climatic extreme event, or the absence of non-debt creating loss and damage financing. High-level events after those, high-level debts after those climate events make more difficult for governments to finance reconstruction and recovery after the events. Again, women, rural population, indigenous communities are the ones bearing most of the social cost. As the government is unable to invest or to sufficiently invest in adaptation, rural women face the loss of income as well as harvest due to climate change, which is often the sole sources for food and income. Due to climate change emergency, food sources, even for urban women, become more unpredictable and scarcer and with higher prices, which is affected also by the subsidies costs that are linked to fiscal consolidation policies. As you can see, there is a compounded impact that is affecting the poorest populations. And let me finish by saying that I agree a lot with what Uli Bolt says. The problems related to increasing and unsustainable debt levels and the financial needs of the climate emergency should be addressed in a much more comprehensive and much more ambitious way than the conventional debt for climate swaps. Even when these instruments can be useful for at local level to free up resources for useful projects, these debt swaps won't solve neither the debt crisis nor provide sufficient resources for climate action. And I am afraid that sometimes focusing on debt for climate swaps can become a distraction from what is really needed. And from the civil society perspective, what is needed is ambition and robust response, as Mr. Federa said. For us, this is a comprehensive and ambitious debt cancellation for all countries that need it through a multilateral, transparent, and fair sovereign debt resolution mechanism from all creditors. And on the other side, sufficient and not debt creating public climate finance. Let me finish in there, and maybe we can comment also on the case of Belize in the questions and answers space. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Yolanda. And thank you to all of us. We've now completed our first round of questions. And I have to thank you, especially for how good you are on time. We have plenty of time for the second round, and hopefully for a good interaction with the audience. There are already a few questions posted in the chat that I've taken note of. But I also noticed that some of the members of the audience are raising their hands, and I would advise you to post the question in the chat box, as this is a webinar, and someone with a higher knowledge of the technical issues can tell you that doesn't work. So we will take the questions through the chat if you would please put them there. So. To get us going in the second round, I would like to come back to you, Alagi, and maybe dive a little deeper into these issues and asking you to look ahead. To what extent are the fiscal constraints impeding climate action in the Gambia? And in your opinion, sir, how can this be addressed? You are muted, sir.
Sorry about that.
There you are.
Okay.
There you are.
So, like I'm saying, the pandemic has already compounded already existing problem for most V20 countries, or for all the V20 countries. And what we're seeing is the pandemic is prolonging, and it seems like we don't have an end in sight yet. And I think my colleague from Rwanda did mention this, the inequities when it comes to the access to vaccines and the numbers that are vaccinated around the world. And our health experts are telling us that we're not safe until all of us are safe. So if one part of the world is fully vaccinated and the other part is not, then the pandemic may still linger. So the prolonged pandemic and the uneven global recovery are dampening growth prospects. With weak economic growth, fiscal constraints will continue to be elevated. Because we know, like, if we look at the world economy is so integrated, even developing countries like we, in terms of our exports, tourism, etc. If global growth prospects are low, then that means that we expect, let's say, resources or revenues from exports, from tourism, especially with the pandemic and the restrictions, to continue to be low. Climate action in the Gambia means we have to focus on long-term investments, including in infrastructure. It should not just be short-term investments or short-term fixes. That would not solve the problem. These investments are needed to make sure that we build climate resilience and protect climate vulnerable populations. And if we look at a country like the Gambia, we have the most ambitious NDC. But without adequate financing and adequate support, it may be very difficult for us to deliver on that. As a country, we have formulated a long-term climate vision, and we're trying to develop a strategy around it. We've had an SPCR, that is Strategic Program for Climate Resilience, with bankable projects. So these investments are needed to ensure the climate-sensitive sectors that we rely on, especially for our exports, are able to withstand climate impacts. Just like, for example, if we look at the tourism industry, which depends a large extent on coastal resources, and we're seeing a lot of coastal erosion and other environmental impacts on the coast. Unless and until we are able to invest in these sectors, it may affect our long-term development trajectory. We need to be able to seize economic opportunities that are opening up as the world shifts to a low-carbon pathway. For example, if we look at a greater part of the LDCs, including vulnerable, the V20, we would still see that, like, the proportion of the population that have access to electricity is relatively low compared to global averages. And technology exists for us to follow low carbon pathways to development. We don't have to take technologies that are very carbon intensive. But with our fiscal space, making any of these investments will be very difficult, despite the fact that they offer a lot of significant benefits. So helping V20 countries, especially like the Gambia, reduce its debt burden is a key piece of the puzzle in creating that room, that fiscal room that is required for long-term investment. Because unless and until we have the fiscal space, it may be very, very difficult for us to make those long-term investments that will help make our communities climate resilient, but also help us tread low carbon pathways to development. The ongoing discussions on resilience and sustainability trust are also important. Hope this gets traction, because this trust can help catalyze those investments and enable vulnerable nations access to instruments that match our economic circumstances. I think we owe it to ourselves to ensure that we're able to provide support to V20 nations and to LDCs, because like the projections and are not looking very encouraging on the climate risk, they elevated already. The debt situation is elevated. So unless and until we have robust arrangements and support around this, short-term fixes will not help solve the problem. So we're calling on partners that we continue the dialogue so that we'll be able to have some robust arrangements to be able to address these multidimensional challenges that we face, both on the climate change front, the pandemic, and the debt situation. Because unless and until we're able to address those in a very coherent and mutually supportive way, it may be difficult for us to achieve the kind of sustainable development that we envisage for our people. And to conclude, we are in the last decade of action as far as the sustainable development goals are concerned. But the reports that are coming, like the global reports, are not encouraging. If anything, current trends indicate that we may not be on track to meet the targets on poverty. With the pandemic and closure of schools in many places, access to education is also jeopardized. Access to health, immunization rates are all problematic. So we call on partners for us to continue this dialogue, but for us to put mechanisms in place that will help us address the multidimensional development challenges that we face on various fronts. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. And this leads directly into the next question that I would like to go back to you, Thierry. I like you spoke of mechanisms, the need for mechanisms. So if I could ask you, what kind of debt restructuring framework would help the climate vulnerable countries?
Thank you, Raga. That's a very adequate question. Actually, the V20, ahead of COP26, they released a proposal for a debt for climate swaps and climate prosperity. They proposed debt restructuring options for climate vulnerable countries, taking into account the exposure to climate risk. If you look at a simple figure, just exposure to climate risk, it increased the cost of debt, the cost of capital Yuli was talking about, of vulnerable 20 countries by 117 basis points on average. It comes in addition to a cost of debt that's already very high because it's a country in Africa, and investors will say there is a counterparty risk. What does it mean? It means that for every $10 climate vulnerable countries spend, they have to pay another dollar on top of that in interest. It gives you some more context on why they propose that. This debt support and flexibility propose debt forgiveness and a suppression for highly indebted climate vulnerable countries, which were facing actually imminent liquidity risk, because that's the question. That's the short-term liquidity risk. It's all about that. And there is as well the long-term aspect, but when you see the level of debt, the question is about the liquidity risk. More flexibility on debt as well was required for vulnerable 20 countries to finance their own advancement of climate goals and natural climate-based solutions. So if you take the example of Rwanda or even Congo, we have our forests, so there is reforestation, afforestation, biodiversity, protection of mangroves, all those projects should be taken into account as central aspects of adaptation and resilience planning. Just to go back on the debt level, there is a source and the figure from Reuters. You're going to say that I like figures, actually I do. The East African nation debt level climbed by 30% in 2021, only due to the borrowing of fighting to fight COVID-19. 13% increase. Most of the countries in the world are in some kind of debt burden, but here in Africa especially, and for the vulnerable 20 countries, there is the public stress, and the amount are substantial to tackle the pandemic and that does not help either the climate emergency. COVID and climate change compound for each other. So the compounding effect I am talking about here is more severe for climate vulnerable nations located in Africa than for the rest. And another statistic that I like is from the African Climate Policy Center, which made some projections about rising temperatures from 1 to 4% increase. It impacts negatively the GDP of African countries from -2% to -12%, pure projection. You can easily understand that vulnerable countries have a double penalty. Not only will they be hit the hardest by climate change consequences, but as well, the cost of capital to tackle it is far higher. International public finance, international private finance, multilateral agencies, they can play a vital role to stop this vicious circle. I think Yuli was employing the phrase. I'm taking this from you, Yuli. To stop the vicious circle about that, and how do we provide resilience to vulnerable economies by providing debt support and flexibility through innovative and inclusive, because we're talking about inclusiveness, debt for climate swap to make our local economies benefit from what you would call, in some Keynesian term, the green multiplier effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And moving now to you, Jeroen. Excuse me. In following up on this, in the run-up to the COP26 in Glasgow, the managing director announced that the IMF was working on proposals for addressing debt and climate crisis. What can we expect from the IMF on debt and climate in this year, 2022, and what would your response be to the V20 request from the 55 finance ministers? The floor is yours, Jeroen.
Thank you, Braga. So we agree with almost everything in this V20 statement. So climate vulnerability is indeed driving up the cost of capital. Climate vulnerability is a major source of lack of debt sustainability in this group of countries. Like I said before, not in all, but in this group of countries. Countries with unsustainable debts require debt relief. Debt sustainability analysis should take into account climate related risks, and we are working on that. It's part of our work program. Private sector creditors should participate. And finally, we also take, even though it needs to be through to the idea of credit enhancements for new sustainability linked. So these are themes that I just read off the V20 statement. Now, the sort of the one issue where we are not completely aligned is that although we are completely agree that vulnerable countries need, in some cases, massive additional resources to address climate change, we think we should take a let 1,000 flowers bloom approach for where these resources come from. So we do not think that debt climate swaps in the form of the initiative described in the V20 is the only, perhaps not even the most promising approach to get resources to these countries. And the reason for that is that what's called the grand scale climate debt swap.
Sorry, Jeroen.
Sorry.
Your connection seems to be breaking up a little bit.
Yeah. Let me switch up my video, maybe. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's see if this is better. So the point is, what really matters is to get resources to vulnerable countries to address climate change. How you get those resources is secondary, and that to some extent depends on what is most feasible. So in other words, what are donors, rich countries, creditors, and so forth willing to pay for? And so we should be looking at the full range of transfers, meaning grants, concessional lending. We should be looking at potential credit enhancements that could be provided by MDBs, sometimes also by official bilateral lenders. We should be looking at low-cost lending provided through institutions such as ourselves in the context of the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And we should definitely be looking at debt relief. The problem with a big new global debt initiative, which presumably would be financed mostly by official bilateral countries, in other words, the G20 countries, is that it is hugely ambitious in political terms, because it requires a huge degree of coordination in an area which is geopolitically very thorny, because, as we all know, the major creditors, particularly of African countries, are not members of the Paris Club, which traditionally provided that coordination. And so our attempt to create a coordination structure to solve this problem at a much less ambitious level, the so-called common framework for debt treatments beyond the DSSI, has been, to put it mildly, only half successful. Reflective of those difficulties. And so, the experience with the common framework has taught us that unless we can address those kinds of difficulties, and probably the way to do it is in the context of the current common framework, we're not going to be getting very far, calling for a much more ambitious additional initiative that essentially involves the same players giving larger amounts of money to a particular group of countries, right? So we need to effectively mobilize resources where we can find them. We cannot just focus on one vision of a global new initiative. So that is the only sense in which we disagree, I think, with the 20th statement.
Thank you very much for that, Jeroen. And I'm sure that Uli, who started us off, is anxious to get back in the conversation. So I would like to turn to you now and ask you what the three essential ingredients for an effective climate debt swap mechanisms. What in your mind would those be?
Thanks, Raghav. And if I may just say in response to Jeroen that I fully agree with this let the thousand flowers bloom approach. Debt relief alone will not be sufficient. We certainly need more discussion about additional climate finance, scaling up financing through MDBs. Indeed, even though we just had a SDR issuance, about further SDR issuance, and I think we should also discuss whether we can have a revamped SDR mechanism where the SDRs actually go to the countries that need them and not to mostly to the rich countries. But I think providing debt relief where it's needed is absolutely a crucial part of the conversation. And we've seen many times before, and a few people know as much about this as Jeroen, who's published great stuff about it, that delaying debt relief where it's needed is really making everything worse. So, and this brings me now to what are the three main elements of some debt climate mechanism. First, it's crucial that we get debt sustainability analysis right, and Jeroen also highlighted that the IMF is now working on integrating climate risk into debt sustainability analysis, which is great. But of course, as he indicated, this is still work in progress, and this really needs to be speed up. But also, not only do we need to have crucial climate resilience investment needs integrated into DSAs, but that also has to comprise crucial needs for achieving the SDGs. And I mean, this is a kind of philosophy change for the whole SDG exercise, but arguably not including crucial spending needs on health and education and all that into that sustainability analysis is leading to terrible outcomes. So getting debt sustainability analysis, I think, is crucial. And this debt sustainability analysis, this enhanced debt sustainability analysis, then should provide the basis for discussions which countries should be eligible for comprehensive debt relief. So I'm not saying that each and every country in the V20 or elsewhere needs debt relief, but we really need to do a better job with the DSAs. And again, it's great the IMF is moving in the right direction. So the second point is we need to make sure that private sector involvement is key. Private creditors have not participated in the DSSI, and they haven't been really forthcoming in the common framework either. Rather, what we've been hearing from private creditors is that, any kind of debt relief would be really terrible and permanently exclude debtor countries from capital markets. And this would really undermine all development prospects. And this is plainly wrong. In situations where countries need debt relief, this should actually provide room for recoveries, and then countries will be doing better, and then capital markets will return. I mean, we just need to look at Argentina, which had sufficient private creditors to give new credit time and again, despite being a serial defaulter. So private sector involvement is key, but we need a scheme that provides adequate incentives that ensure that private creditors participate in debt restructuring where needed, and that they bear a fair share of the burden. And this has to involve both carrots and sticks. With colleagues I've put forward, including from Boston University, Kevin Gallagher, I've put forward a proposal for debt relief for green recovery, where we have suggested Brady-type credit enhancements for new bonds that could be swapped with a significant haircut for old debt to facilitate restructuring negotiations. I won't have time to go into that, but so this would be kind of a carrot element. But clearly we also need some very clear steer from the IMF, from multilateral development banks, and indeed from the important member governments that are hosting or kind of that are home to the most important financial centers where the debt has been issued, to really put pressure on creditors to come to the table. Because without private creditor involvement, this is not going anywhere. And what we are already seeing now is that we de facto have public transfers to private creditors. So the IMF, World Bank, other development banks have put a lot of financing to developing countries throughout the crisis, and sizable amounts of that actually has been used to repay private creditors. So instead of using the money for crisis response, health, education, and so on, a lot has already been channeled to private creditors. So private creditor involvement, absolutely crucial. And then thirdly, and I'll be brief, so don't worry, is country ownership. So while I would maintain that debt relief, and you may call it debt for climate swap or however, but that debt relief should be linked to government action on climate and development. But these actions should be formulated by national governments under involvement of civil society. And we've just heard from Alagi and Thierry how their countries have been working very hard on developing climate adaptation strategies, development plans, and so on. So, it's not that they've been sitting idly. They know what to do, what's best for them to address climate vulnerability, to implement their SDG agendas. So when we talk about linking debt relief, debt action on debt with climate and development policies, we should not be talking about kind of conventional IMF-style conditionality. So, of course, we need to make sure that there are good macroeconomic policies and all that. But this is not kind of, or this should not be a discussion about imposing traditional macro conditionality, or, you know, there have also been people who've been saying, aha, now, you know, kind of the idea is to use debt for climate swaps to force developing countries into mitigating climate change, and advanced countries are not doing that themselves. No, this really should be about enabling countries to facilitate, to implement their priority actions on climate and development. So country ownership. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this, Uli. And finally, in this round, before I start taking the questions from the audience, which are many, and I'm looking forward to that. I am wondering, Yolanda, if you could justify my optimism for the year ahead that I mentioned here in the beginning, that this talk is giving me hope. And if you look ahead for this year, where do you see the 2 or 3 clearest opportunities for change?
Yeah, thank you for this.
No pressure.
No pressure. No. As an activist, I mean, I think we have the obligation of being optimistic, and I'm gonna start with a quote by Mark Twain. This quote that says, "They didn't know it was impossible, so they did it." And I started as a debt activist on the 90s, in the late 90s. And I think through that experience, we learn that we need to ask for the impossible to go beyond the feasible. So we, as civil society, we will keep asking for the impossible. I have to say, a lot of the opportunities I see are in line of the elements that Uli mentioned. Private creditor involvement, debt sustainability analysis, and country ownership. And let me start by that one. I think the first, and I guess we can frame it as an opportunity, is that we should listen to V20 countries, to SEEDs, to climate vulnerable countries, to global south countries in general. And I think an opportunity is that we are seeing more and more proposals coming from those countries, listening to their needs, listening to their proposals. We listen today to this proposal of debt restructuring for climate action, but also proposals coming in relation to multidimensional vulnerability indicators that actually need to change, because it doesn't make any sense that it's per capita income, the indicator that tells us which country receives concessional finance or gets into a debt relief initiative. Many of these climate vulnerable countries are excluded today from the common framework. I know the IMF has been also pushing for extending that scope, but this is the reality today. Listening not only to the governments in these countries, but also to civil society and local communities. And I think one of the opportunities is that the debt community is reinforced since the last couple of years and organized, and we are here to fight for these impossible solutions. And that means on the official side also that discussions around debt resolution cannot be limited to G20 countries. I know this is the feasible, I know this is what is happening, but we need to include borrowing countries into the discussion and the decision-making space of what is the best debt treatment, debt resolution. We need a truly multilateral discussion on how to address this debt crisis, as we have a truly multilateral discussion when it comes to addressing what it needs to be made for climate with the COPs and the whole UN process around that. By truly multilateral, I mean with all countries on the table in a democratic setting. FFD Forum this year in April could be a chance for raising this up. The second thing is we have identified these interlinkages between debt and climate today. And as Uli Vol said, I think this should provide us with an opportunity for a broad and profound review of the debt sustainability concept. I go a little bit beyond. It's not just reviewing about the DSA methodology, as the fund and the bank do regularly, but I'm talking about having a profound discussion about how to approach the concept of debt sustainability itself. I think we have knowledge, we have intelligence, we have views that can help us go towards a debt sustainability concept that is not merely based in capacity of payment, and discussing how to define and then operationalize a debt sustainability approach that puts human rights, gender equality, and climate at its core. And finally, obviously, I think with the implementation of the common framework, we also have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to see what's lacking and to see what we need to, how we need to advance. And I think civil society, as we have been in the past 2 years, we will be there. As I said, we are organized, we are active, we are positive that we will succeed in finding the best solutions that not only address these debt vulnerabilities, as I said, taking into consideration how much is it possible to pay back, but addressing that, taking into consideration public services, taking into consideration SDGs, taking into consideration the climate challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I knew I could count on you for demonstrating optimism here in the final question. But moving now, and let's use the time well. The questions from the audience. I would like to follow up maybe first, and as well, it was also raised in the chat from Scott Vaughan regarding the example from Belize that Jeroen, you mentioned. If you could amplify that comment a little bit, and the lessons from this private sector NGO creditor approach that might inform wider sovereign debt treatment. So I quoting Scott's question, and maybe since that came up also from Yolanda, if you could give your perspective quickly in response. But Jeroen, and the shorter, clearer, the better. Thank you.
So what was interesting about this operation is that it's an example for how private money can be mobilized, probably over and above what could have been mobilized in a standard debt restructuring operation, because of the presence of a biodiversity/climate element, right? So the private sector, now this is not necessarily the original creditors, but taken as a whole, private funders were willing to pay more and go further in terms of providing debt relief because it was linked to a climate biodiversity project, a coral reef protection project, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is, demonstrates that while linking debt relief to climate investments or related investments from a debt sustainability perspective has this additional cost that you are, in a sense, quote unquote, forcing the country into undertaking extra expenditures, it can also help mobilize more resources, right? And so it can be genuinely useful to address a debt problem. What this transaction, however, also showed, it's very difficult to replicate, right? You need to find out, you need to tease out just the right project that is going to be attractive for the creditors or for third-party donors. And so the main problem remains, which is that that's what transactions of this type are very costly and difficult to put together compared to plain vanilla debt relief. And just to say one more thing about that, the way to get out of this box, and I think Uli and others would agree with me on that, is to not tie the climate or biodiversity component to just a one custom designed project, but to tie it to budgetary spending, or to tie it to outcomes in a broader range of areas. And in that sense, I think this idea of expanding debt climate swaps involving private money is very, very closely linked to the idea of how one can develop and expand sustainability-linked bond markets. It's basically the same idea, right? You need to find observable outcomes, and people then pay for these outcomes, rather than having to construct a specific bespoke project, which is very difficult and very case-specific. So we are completely behind this agenda, but we are not the main actor in this agenda. Right? The World Bank, for example, is leading in that.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. A quick response from you.
Yeah, I mean, the Belize case and other cases are not problematic per se, but the argument that we put on the table is whether they are a distraction. If we take the case of Belize, debt was unsustainable before this operation. Belize's debt has gone through debt restructurings 3 times in the past 15 years. And with this operation, we might give the sense that the work with debt restructuring is done here, because it's a big part of the debt. But and the level of haircut that it was that they got from the creditors because of the link to the conservation project, and I see the positive side on that, was big enough. But the problem is that this is not sufficient to take the debt levels of the country to sustainable levels. And it's very difficult to complete that process now that this deal is done. And what we could end up happening is a country with this commitment to invest in ocean conservation, which is very important for the country, because it's linked to its tourism industry and obviously to the environmental objectives. But that on the other hand, the country have to go through a very harsh fiscal consolidation with impacts on public services, on people's rights, to get to debt sustainable levels. What I'm trying to say is that we need to look at the full picture, and maybe this could have happened within a process of overall debt restructuring in the country. Is this distracting for this main need for a debt restructuring? It might be. Mm-hmm. We will see what happens in the next year.
Thank you. There's a question from David Patterson that I would like to ask and get a reflection from Thierry and Alaki. Just very quickly, I'm sorry to be rushing because of the time. The question is, what kind of conditionality is envisaged and would be acceptable to V20? And this issue is not limited to debt for climate action swaps, of course. Helpful to know what assurances could be given that the relief will indeed result in climate action and help for vulnerable communities. Thierry, would you like to start, and then Alaki, and I ask you to be succinct, please.
Yes, absolutely. I will be fast. In a few words, we have our national determined contributions, which is just a list of our engagement to the UN, but as well you have a list of the biggest projects that we have per sector in agriculture, in infrastructure, electricity, etc., etc. So just picking one of those projects, and it will be the case, you will see that the project is green and sustainable and respecting the green pillars. So it's not that difficult to prove that the project is green, and we are already doing it. Just to add a precision on IMF, and Jérôme, I think, was about to say it. IMF has been doing quite a great job as well to help the vulnerable countries, because they're looking right now on a resilience and sustainability trust. So on what is that based? There is the special drawing rights that most of its funds that high-income countries have in IMF reserve, around 650 billion USD. And there has been a question, and I think, Jeremy, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a question about how to transfer that to low-income countries, and it could be a solution for us to give you some optimistic views, Raga, on how we can go out of the crisis. The resilience and sustainability trust can be a solution.
Thank you, Thierry. You have a job at the fund anytime.
This is good. This is good. We're making offers here, making progress. Alagi, would you like to add a comment to that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raga. And like I indicated earlier, and Thierry also indicated, we already have a lot of plans. We already have a lot of strategies. We already have a lot of projects that have been developed that are climate sensitive, that speaks to issues of climate change adaptation and building resilient communities. And I think if there are arrangements around financing to know whether those finances are actually being used for climate resilience is something that can be tracked. There are so many arrangements that a lot of these B20 countries have gone through, like for example, in the Gambia, we have projects that are results-based financing. That means upfront, you agree on what results are going to be achieved, and based on the attainment of the results, then further financing is made available. So I think we can think innovatively around these issues, but I think we should be able to together discuss and be able to agree on a framework that will transparently be able to indicate that actually resources that are being made available are really being deployed to climate resilience and making our communities resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just to make sure that we have equality here, I want to give Uli the last question. And I'm sorry to the audience that I couldn't get the questions in, but I urge the organizers to save the chat, because there's a lot of very interesting information that is accumulating there. But Uli, there's a question to you from Sebastian Willehart. Which is there a possibility to link debt for climate swaps with the loss and damage discussion at COP26? If yes, then how, and preferably in 30 seconds?
Oh, God.
Small question.
Well, I think for loss and damage, we actually need an additional mechanism. Because this has to do with additional resources. So I think with the current discussions about debt sustainability, this is more about past debt, how to address the past debt. And of course, a lot of the historical debt arguably are also linked to loss and damage. But I think we need an additional effort to ramp up the loss and damage discussion, because these are external shocks to climate vulnerable countries from a crisis they have not contributed to at all. And in a nutshell, my proposal would be to completely rethink the SDR framework and basically allocate SDRs specifically to countries that are hit by climate shock. And I know that's a completely deviation from the current system, but I think we need new resources for every new climate shock where clearly there is no responsibility by the countries themselves. Sorry, that was very imprecise, but that's my thinking.
That was very good, very clear, and very, very, very topical. I would like to thank all of you, but before we conclude, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rishi Pandari. He's the Assistant Director of Global Economic Governance Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. He's co-organizing this with us, and thank you for a good cooperation. I would like to invite you to give some final remarks. Over to you, Rishi.
Great. Thank you so much, Raga. This has been a very informative and rich discussion. I'll just very quickly highlight a few things that stood out to me. First, we have heard very, very clearly about how debt distress is directly linked and is also holding back climate action. So there is a major opportunity in our hands to tackle both of these crises together. And some of you were also clear in highlighting the urgency of the crises and the need for immediate action and not delaying debt relief in particular. Second, while there have been ongoing efforts, our collective global policy response really needs to match the scale of these interlocking crises. As some of you have highlighted, a critical piece for all of us to think about, I think, is how to get the private sector on board to ensure that debt relief is truly comprehensive and sustainable. And of course, that also includes major creditors inside or outside the Paris Club. Third, we also heard about the crucial role that the institutions like the IMF have to play in helping to devise an arrangement that really works for everyone. And we just heard about how the IMF is actively discussing the design of a resilience and sustainability trust. And so there is an important opportunity for this particular RST to play a major role in helping to reduce debt distress while also supporting climate change goals. Now, as we know, discussions on climate change and debt often take place in separate venues. And so I think the panelists have done a great job in laying out how interconnected these issues really are. And so I hope that this event is just one step forward in having a more integrated and cohesive discussion that really cuts across these various silos. And so the mission of the GDP Center is to conduct policy research for a better world. And so we're especially glad to have co-hosted this event with the OECD Development Center. And so I'd like to thank all of the panelists, the audience, and our respective teams, and of course, you, Raga, for your excellent moderation. So thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Rishi, and a great thanks to you right back, and also to Maureen, Kevin, and everyone else at the Boston University GDP Center, as well as to Sarah Ahmed in Manila for making this event happen. It has been such a privilege and such a pleasure to co-host this event with you, and I hope it's only that we're only just beginning. And of course, a very big thank you also to our wonderful panelists. It's been a fascinating and highly productive conversation, and I can tell you that we will be following your work very closely. And also, finally, thank you very much for our audience for tuning in. I know that the last time I know, there was a little fewer than 500 guests, members of the audience tuning in. We hope that you have enjoyed it and that you will join us in our other DEF Talks in the future and the future events of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. So with this, I say thank you once again, goodbye, and have a great day and evening from all of us here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raga, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, Raga. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. That was